Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Building Great Experiences podcast. This is Drew Burdick, and with me, I have wonderful human and friend, Beth Jackson. Beth and I met almost 8, 10 years ago at Red Ventures, where we both worked. Fun little story. So when I was there, I was part of this program called MLEP. It was a 6-month kind of leadership development program. Beth was the trainer, the coach, and was an amazing experience. I learned, honestly, a lot of the leadership lessons that I've gained over the years have come from Beth. And so she's a great human, great leader. And the other thing, just to kind of tee up the conversation, we're going to be talking a lot about employee experience today. We're going to be talking about the intersection of customer experience and employee experience. There's this great thing I like to say, which is happy employees, happy customers, happy investors. And so we're going to be digging into that. So anyway, Beth, welcome to the show. Love you to introduce yourself and get into it.
Thanks, Drew. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I have a consulting practice called Talent Development Specialist, where I work with companies of all sizes to help them with their organizational development and their professional development of their employees. So on the organizational development side, I do everything from strategic planning to infrastructure, culture, talent-related initiatives. And on the professional development side, I create and implement workshops, leadership workshops. I like to work with a lot of frameworks, things like emotional intelligence or bringing sales and marketing teams together, doing actualized leadership teamwork. Really, I can do custom work, but also work with a lot of very popular frameworks and assessments to kind of ground the conversation and then move those individuals forward in the organization.
Awesome. Well, great to have you. I'm excited to dig into this topic. Before we kind of like fully dive into this, why don't you define a little bit what talent development is? Maybe not everybody knows, or maybe they have some assumptions of what they think it is. But for you, like, what do you think talent development is?
Yeah, so it's a great phrase, right? It's a little bit lofty. I love that when you think about all of your employees as talent. I get a little bit of a kick out of it. I remember trying to explain to my parents or sometimes my friends, like, well, what do you do? I say talent development. They look at me kind of strange, like, is it Hollywood? Like the word talent can be a little new to some people. For my dad, he was in the military. And so he's like, oh, you're in personnel and records. I'm not in charge of anybody's records. Trust me, that would be a serious problem. But really, if you, at the history of how we, I think, have landed into a great place in looking at employees as talent. Prior to that, we'd hear terms like human resources, where at least we're moving from personnel and records and into valuing people, right? So they are considered a resource. And then things kind of evolved into being called something like human capital, where you're thinking, okay, now it's an investment. So companies are paying attention. Let me invest in my people. And now I think we're in a much better space. I love the phrase talent development. It's very specific, and it really has to do with the organization partnering with their employee base to move them up, move them across the organization, help invest in their skills where they want to go. And so that there's alignment between the individual, the employee, and the company's goals. And that's really the role of talent development, is to work both sides of that to bring the employees up in alignment with the organizational goals.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about the intersection of talent, employee development, and customer experience, and why it's so important to bring those things together. I think in my world with customer experience, there's a lot of energy around how do we improve the customer experience? How do we make it better? Because there's obvious reasons for that. It drives growth, it drives revenue, it drives profitability, it drives all these things. But an important piece that often gets missed, which is why I'm excited to have you on the show, is the employee component of that. And I think one of the things that we talked about we had a coffee recently for folks that are listening. Beth and I caught up. We're grabbing a coffee. And we were discussing change and change management, how that fits into it. I mean, you were talking about this kind of Venn diagram. So maybe talk a little bit more about that intersection, the Venn diagram, and the change component of it.
Sure. Yeah, it was great. I thought, when you and I sat down and you were like, yeah, I'm, working on stuff around customer experience. And then you mentioned, the employee experience, and it was so rich and it was kind of like visual in my head. It was like, great. really, if you think about that intersection between what's happening at the customer experience level, and then you've got the employee experience, is really this thing that sits in the middle, which is change management. And how can you have these, you're making all of these great changes so that your employees your customers are experiencing your product really well or your service really well. Man, if it's not integrated on the inside, if the employees are unhappy or not trained or kept up to speed, if the communication is not linked between those two, well, now you've got this big gap. So what is it? What is the intersection of the three? And of course, what popped into my head was Venn diagrams. I'm kind of nerdy like that. I love anything visual, and teaching with visuals are really helpful and powerful. And I thought about Venn diagrams, and I really love, again, back to the nerdiness, but Adam Grant does some really cool Venn diagrams that are out there. So one of the ones that he has out there that always cracks me up is around, he's got the three circles, and what's hanging around in the middle is, or at the top is philosophy professors. On the other side is 3-year-old kids. And then on the other side is Backstreet Boys. And, what do they have in common? And the thing that they all have in common is tell me why. It's like, that's so nerdy, but it makes you laugh, and it makes you think about like, what's the common bond here? When we're talking about this intersection of change management, and we're talking about employee talent development or employees, and we're talking about customers, the three things inside is, if you change the language and you talk about each of them as an experience, somehow it lifts and changes how you approach things. So if you've got this great effort on employee experience, you've got this great effort on customer experience, and then you look at change management also for the experience, now you're headed in a really powerful direction.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me because so when we were talking before, I had this kind of like revelatory moment when you used the words change experience instead of change management, which I thought was really fascinating. We kind of talked a little bit about what that is, like what is change experience. Maybe elaborate for listeners, what is change experience? How does it differ from change management? Is it the same? Is it, are there nuances? Just how do you see it and why does it matter?
Yeah. So I think, it's when you're approaching change, one of the first things that I'll kind of tell you what my first formal introduction was to the concept of change management. And when I was moving over from doing sales training and moving into leadership development, my very first assignment that was given to me was to read this book called Flawless Consulting by Peter Block. So it's a pretty iconic book, well known. Of course, I'm looking at it going, I'm not a consultant, like I work here. But one of the key things inside of that book, one of the key takeaways from that, really had a lot to do with change management, and had everything to do with something called, he talks about resistance quite a bit. And what do you do with resistance? And so I recommend this book to anybody who wants to increase their personal influence and really kind of deepen any relationships that they're having with people. And the concept of resistance is, it's data, right? You have to take that data in. And there are so many things that will, rather than like kind of just grinding something through, you really have to pay attention to, wow, okay, this is the direction that I think we need to head, or that I want to head, or that the organization wants to head. But the people are providing input. You can strategize all day long on paper, but then once you take something to the mat and you're trying to implement it, you start to feel this resistance. People are naturally resistant to change. It's kind of our fight or flight. It's our chemistry. It's our biology. It's our evolution as humans. So respect that. And then really make sure that you work through. And in this book, he gives you lots of strategies for thinking through how to handle resistance, because I think that's such an important part. And you have to have such a great respect for what that might look like.
Yeah, it's good. I completely agree, man. Having worked in a lot of different organizations and seeing people trying to do things to someone, right? Like we're gonna have change happen to someone versus change with. Very different, mindset and very different outcome. I think especially when we think about employees, when things are just being done to them, they get frustrated, they're not bought in, they're apathetic, they might actually undermine the situation, right?
Yeah.
But when you do it with them, there's less resistance because they're part of the defining of the thing, and they're part of shaping it, and it feels like that, oh, I had a hand in this. I want to do this. I enjoy doing this. I'm part of making this different. And it's a really subtle detail that with, not to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, maybe other ways to approach this change where you can drive the adoption, the buy-in, the philosophical alignment of employees so that they do want to, participate in this change.
Yeah, that's such a great word that you used, right? Changes to. And one of the things that I think is a common theme in a lot of the work I do has to do with organizational vocabulary and shared vocabulary and how important it is. And you can just get these tiny subtle shifts that really just speak volumes around attitudes and kind of intentions and things like that. And so you mentioned changes to somebody. Nobody likes that, right? Nobody wants changes to happen to them. We want to be accepted for exactly how we are and how we see the world. And that's really kind of our comfort zone. So changes too are usually met with that, kind of that stiff resistance. It's funny, kind of a piece in the middle there in the self-help world, if you will. I think Oprah has been a big proponent of this, and other kind of self-help gurus, if you will, try to shift that language and say, well, this is happening for you, right? Change is happening for you. Think about that for a minute, right? Like in your personal life, you're like, okay, well, like I can accept that. That sounds cool. At work, right? You're like, this is happening for you. And somehow that seems a little bit condescending, right? Like, oh no, we know better. This is going to happen for you. But when you can get to that place where everybody's thinking about it in terms of changing with people, now what does that take, right? That's going to take a whole lot of it's going to take on a different tone, and you can really kind of get people bought in and ask, right? And listen and pay attention to what I was mentioning earlier, is that data and those signals of where's the resistance happening, and what can we learn from that as we move forward. And I think that changes with piece is really kind of the game changer, switching up that vocabulary.
Yeah. I consider myself like this student of culture. I'm a big believer in it. I think, there's the classic quote from Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? A lot of organizations, they design these great strategies. They come up with some big grand plan, transformation program. And, frankly, if they don't have the culture that can metastasize it or internalize it, it like doesn't really matter. It's dead on arrival. So I think, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on how does culture come into play with this whole notion of change experience.
Yes, culture is interesting. You can define it, I think, a lot of different ways. One of the ways I really love to think about culture is, how do we do stuff around here, right? How do we get things done? What is it that we value? What is it that we promote? What is it? I've also heard it rephrased sometimes, culture is what we put up with. It's all of it. A couple of key things around change and moving an organization forward in when considering the culture are in fact some of those values. What are some of the things that you put into you put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing. And I think one of the key elements has to do with being resilient. If you can build a culture that is resilient, you're going to see that from the inside out and from the outside in. And, I worked for one of my first professional jobs out of college. I worked for a healthcare strategist. He was very good at what he did, and he was really good at building this internal culture for us as an agency. It was an ad agency. And one of the things he constantly said to us, we would hear it over and over and over again, was test and learn, iterate, test and learn. And so we were constantly doing that internally within our organization, but we were also bringing that to our clients. And that just became, that was one of our mantras, was around, really being a resilient culture and kind of living that every day. So mistakes were made. It's like, yep, let's figure that out, but let's not ruminate on it. All right.
Yeah.
Let's kind of keep on going.
Yeah.
So that was kind of one of the first ones. And then I think another really important pillar around your culture can be around the learning aspect of your culture. And when you have this learning mindset of shared knowledge, you can get into some cultures and you can see where information is hoarded. And that's really going to put the brakes on the growth of your organization, because you're only going to have a few people kind of moving in one direction, or frankly kind of moving up into leadership positions, and you won't have this the ability to be resilient, because you don't have this learning culture where everybody is responsible for learning and everybody is responsible for sharing the learning. So kind of that shared knowledge is really an area of tremendous growth for any organization. If they can build that into the culture and into the expectations, then I've seen them. Those are the types of cultures that really excel.
So we've talked about this before. There's a really good book called Culture Code and the Culture Playbook by Daniel Coyle. Love both of those. I've given probably a dozen people Culture Playbook in the last, year or so since it came out. But in it, there's I think in the foreword, there's this statement that says culture is action, something to that effect. And this idea that culture, sometimes people think of it as like a static thing. Like, you set culture and then it kind of stays that way forever. And really it's the cumulative sum of your actions up until that point. And so you can change culture. Culture can evolve, but it really is like what you do. It's the ever changing sort of dynamics at play of the actions that leaders and people are doing in an organization. And I think, sometimes, like, I've worked in very large organizations, very small organizations, and everywhere in between. And there's this tendency to feel like, well, culture it just is, and you're like, no, you can change it. And like, to your point on the test and learn piece, like, I think sometimes people want to come up with some big grand master plan, right? To like, all right, how are we going to change the culture? And you're like, just start doing small experiments and start to move the sort of status quo in the direction that you're trying to get to. And that will inevitably create a different culture, right? Different dynamic. Like I like if you're familiar with, Google has this thing called the X Company, also known as the Moonshot Factory. And they've created this very, really rich culture of, come up with these moonshot ideas and what's the fastest, cheapest way to test and basically like prove that your idea is wrong. Like the whole culture is around like, let's just test things. And like, we know most of it's going to be bad, but like occasionally we'll come up with something great. And like, they're the ones that have created a whole bunch of really interesting innovations. Like I think they just created one recently that was something to do with like, it converts, I don't know, it's like carbon to oxygen or something crazy. Like there's this big, it was one of those moonshot things they just came up with. And it all came from this idea of testing and learning and that being just part of, embedded in the culture.
Yeah. I love that. I think something that a theme that kind of runs through what you're saying, and just with that example, is that sounds like a culture that it's not led by fear. Right? It's led by possibility, and it's not risk averse. It's just the opposite. So if you can, you don't have to be fearless, but if you could just fear a little less, inside of your people, and really encourage them and look for, is failure, failure's such a great word, in training, you'll often see people take that acronym. It's nope, it's not fail, it's first attempt in learning, and reframing what it is. So what did we learn from it? Oh, and laugh, right? With a little bit of humor, like, remember that, doo-doo of an idea, like that didn't work, but there's going to be a lot of people in the organization who they're going to take their cues, from that. So in your example, like, right? They're declaring it and they've got all the infrastructure around that, but small shifts that companies can make towards it's okay, right? What did we learn from this? And people will pick up on that. And those are ways that you can subtly start to shift your culture, I think, which is important. I think the other awesome thing that you made me think of is how another way to shift your culture is when you think about the people that you're bringing into your organization, right? The people that are joining your organization. They have very rich experiences from, all different companies. And the more that you can integrate that early and begin to expose them and kind of have that, again, that shared, that reciprocity of learning between kind of the old folks who've been here a while, right? Kind of your legacies, and then your new people. That's another really important inflection point to pay attention to in terms of how your culture is evolving and serving you.
Yeah. I've not heard the first attempt in learning acronym for fail. I love that. I'm totally stealing that.
Yep, you can have it.
So one more thing on this topic, and we'll transition into employee experience. One of the things that I love, going back to the Moonshot Factory, is they consider everything innovation compost. And it's this idea that when you try things out and you fail or it doesn't work, they don't see it as like we failed. They see it as like compost for further innovation, right? And like they've had all these different breakthroughs because things that they tried before that didn't work for whatever reason, they were like, hey, we learned that thing from that project we did 2 years ago that we could probably apply here. And it's like, it's seemingly, totally out of left field, but they've had all these tremendous breakthroughs because of it. And so I think it's just like a mindset thing. Like if you think about failure as learning, as compost, if you will, for innovation, and you incentivize that behavior and you encourage it. Like, I mean, one of the other things that I think the Moonshot Factory does is they actually, whoever is like leading a project, when they decide to like stop the project because they've decided that it's not possible, right? Whatever it is that they're trying to do, they actually will like get them up in front of the whole company, like celebrate them. They give them a big bonus. They like basically like applaud their failure and their sort of like willingness to quit because, they've already sunk 2 years of their life into this project, and it's hard, right? It's like there's an emotional attachment to the things that you've done. And so anyway, I think there's a lot of opportunity for many organizations to encourage and promote and foster an environment where failure isn't considered failure. It's considered, creating a kind of the ground soil that you need, like fertile environment for ideas and creativity.
Exactly. Like think about those words, right? So fertile, rich, soil, all of that's very, very sensory in a really positive way. So that vocabulary, once again, why that's so important and how that is processed within the organization. I love it. I'll take that bonus too.
Yeah, right. So let's zoom out and let's go to employee experience. I'd love to get your thoughts at kind of a more macro level on that component. Obviously, we talk a lot about change, but yeah, just love to hear your thoughts on employee experience.
Yeah, so I think it's when you and I first, when we sat down a little while ago, and I was like, wow, that to me was such an aha around how you spend all this investment on the customer experience side. Are you doing the same for your employees, right? And are they experiencing a very similar thing? With employees, it all starts with employees who might be customers first, right? And so how they are introduced to your brand or into your service, that can be key. I had a client once who did a really good job with this. They were a premium consumer packaged goods company and a little bit higher end on the spectrum. And they did a great job with their employees in making sure that everything that they did, that the employees understood that our product is priced a certain way. And so it really infiltrated how they treated each other, how they acted, the demeanor of the organization towards those employees, even down to like making decisions about the company cars that they drove and things like this. So kind of that consistency between your brand and your employee experience. And that was one that I think was a really very punctuated example for me. But I've also had experiences working with organizations where the business was very transactional, and I gotta say it bled over right into the employees. So you have to be aware of, if this is how our business model sits, are we also treating our employees that way? And it was always a point of contention and tension. And I think, kind of looking back, if we had maybe put it through that lens a little bit tighter, maybe different decisions would have been made around how to lead that employee group.
Yeah. You just triggered two thoughts. One is, I've said this before in other places, but this idea that like everyone's a customer, right? Including your employees, including your team, including your friends and family, including your boss, your leaders, stakeholders, executives, whoever it might be, right? Like if you kind of take this approach of like everyone's a customer, then you start to think about the world and not in the like transactional way, but in the way that you're like, you should care about what they care about. You should be intentional about how you're, engaging with them. You should be focusing on how to make the experience better. And, sometimes I think, and especially legacy organizations, to your point, this sort of transactional nature that, or mindset that they have about customers, it is how they interact with everybody, right? It becomes, not to name names, but I've interacted with leaders who the way they interact with their family is transactional, right? The way that they interact with their kids is transactional. It's like, it's almost like a fundamental value system about people, like human beings. And I think, in order to, not to get super philosophical, but I think in order to have organizations that truly value human beings, you have to have leaders who truly value human beings. And that isn't always the case, right? There's a lot of times where you have organizations that just don't care. Like they just genuinely are like, I don't really care. I'm trying to make money. That's why I'm here. That's all that matters. And so my opinion is I'm a big believer of like, go work with the organizations that have leaders who do care, right? Because those are going to be the great organizations of the future. If you look at the way the world is headed in the future of work, right? A lot of things are going to be automated, removed from needing people to do stuff. And the human relationship piece is going to be so much more critical. So the folks who are thinking transactionally, they're going to become a commodity business, and they're gonna lose steam because they don't care about people, And anyway, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. It's
No worries.
I could go a whole topic, but anyway, let's talk a little bit about employee engagement, because I see a lot of quotes and data and polls around this idea of employee engagement. So what does that play in the role, or what role does that play in the employee experience?
Yeah. So I love employee engagement conversation. It aligns perfectly, obviously, to developing talent. I think Gallup is probably the one that comes to mind for me. Gallup's been doing studies for, 25 years maybe on employee engagement. And it's kind of stinky, really. It hovers around, if you're going to average it, it kind of hovers around this 30% mark. And, at a high, I think during the pandemic, I think it actually reached kind of a critical high where we were all on high alert, right? Like, wait a minute, now I'm working from home and I don't want to lose my job. And then people are like, oh, wait, I don't want to lose the employees. And so there was a little bit more effort. We had to work harder at work in some environments. And so I think there was like the highest was like 36% employee engagement. Well, that stinks. If you think about that, then that's like 70, flip it, right? So that means that, you only have 30 something percent of your employees that are engaged. That's 70% that aren't. So I always like to put it through this lens of what I call discretionary engagement. And so really that's what you're looking for when you're looking for engagement, because you get paid. People get paid a salary, and this is the work, this is the work that I get paid for. And so from here to here, and that's just kind of the you want to talk about transactional, right? That's the transactional part of being an employee. How can I motivate or tap into the motivation and really support an employee who has a little bit extra to give? And that extra is kind of that is that discretionary piece. It's the piece they're like, I really want this, right? Or I'm really going to kind of put the extra effort in here. I've got more ideas, so I'm going to provide them. I've got a louder voice. I'm going to help out in this area, etc. So that's really that discretionary engagement. That's what you're going after. Put all your infrastructure in place. Make sure that the train's running on the tracks as it relates to kind of the core of someone's work. But how can you really build a relationship with them and tap into that discretionary engagement? Yeah, you thought?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought, like discretionary, because I'll throw this out there and I'm going to test this idea with you live. I think that there's this interesting correlation between empowerment and engagement. So if employees feel empowered, if they feel like they have, been given the ability to kind of move autonomously, they have the resources they need to be, successful, I think they become more engaged, you know? And I think that the idea of like discretion of like who to invest in or how, like, I wonder, this is more just me thinking out loud. Like, I wonder if there's a level of, if you create empowerment in your employees, that actually it would drive their engagement. Like it would almost like rising tides, rise all boats kind of thing, where everyone's like, wow, I feel empowered to actually make a difference here. Now I'm more engaged. And then, you start to see a higher level of engagement in general versus kind of differentiating, saying like, these are the actively disengaged people or these are the engaged people. And we're going to kind of, you know, treat them differently or we're going to interact with them differently. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your response to that.
Yeah, so many connections actually. So I'll try and stay disciplined in my reactions to those. But you just mentioned actually disengaged or actively disengaged. I do want to put the flip side a little bit to the engaged employee, or just kind of the meh employees where we're trying to get that discretionary engagement out. There are people who are actively disengaged. These are the people who are seeking to exit the organization. These are people who are actively trying to just miserable, right? And so that hovers at around 15%. I'm not sure. I wish I had a magic bullet for that group, but as you mentioned, right, some of the core things, if we were doing better at some of the core things, maybe we could get that number down. Sometimes it's just, somebody's time to get onto something else, but oftentimes boredom can, I think, someone can be overwhelmed or bored. And those are some really key areas that I think are at play in that active disengagement group. I think to think about kind of this autonomy piece, there are two key connections I have to that. One is in adult learning theory and how do adults learn? And the theory behind that talks about that someone needs to be open to learning, right? So the description that's often given is kind of a cup, right? And so you have to be able to pour water into the pitcher. There has to be a hole in the top of the cup. Otherwise, somebody's not going to be open to learning. So that's one of the key learning principles. The other, though, has to do with being self-directed. Right. Think about a 2-year-old. Me do it, right? They want to tie their shoes. They want to open the car door, right? So these are just really great parts of being a human and maturing. And so people want to be self-directed. So that's one of the things in learning design that I always put in there. It's like choices, this or this, right? And so really kind of tapping into that for your employees, knowing that being self-directed and choice is such a key element. And I think the person who really brought this to the forefront is Daniel Pink in his book, Drive. And he's got a great TED Talk on it. I know we explored that when we did the leadership development program together. Talks about, what really drives people is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So I call that the AMP. And the autonomy piece is huge. It's like hire great people and get out of their way. And so providing that environment, we talk about a culture of engagement, is really trying to unlock that and move people in spaces that they feel safe to explore that and to actually make those choices and be self-directed in their work.
Yeah, agreed. Echo everything you just said. And, just as a pupil in, past years, I can completely, say that you have done a great job of when designing programs that people are, they are self-directed, there is choice, there is, and I think your point on the people have to kind of opt in, so to speak, they have to have their cup, the lid has to be off. I think you design it really well where people raise their hand and then there's sort of you have to demonstrate that you want it. It's not sort of a forced mandate. What are some of the other ways that, people who are listening can engage employees?
Yeah, so I would love to put in a commercial and say, "Oh, do workshops." And I do those and I love them. They're not the answer to everything though, right? I think the number one way is to give people meaningful work. What is that key plum assignment? I still draw the box on this is your day to day. What do you have ownership of? What is something that you're really driving? And so to create, and everybody at every level of the organization opted into that and locked into that. So making sure that everybody has meaningful work and part of that meaningful work, identifying it, getting either as a manager, observing it and saying like, hey, I think you'd be really good at this, right? The idea of stretching is really very powerful in those conversations. And getting people involved and engaged in that work is one of the key elements to that is also paying attention. Right? So when you have managers who are disconnected from it, you just want to cringe when someone says, yeah, keep doing what you're doing, or you don't think anybody's watching or that it even matters. Well, why am I doing it? Right? That instantly makes it not meaningful. And so that relationship again is really critical so that the manager is equally engaged and having those conversations, checking in, not micromanaging, but checking in and saying, I care about this. I know it's important to you. It's important to the organization, and doing legitimate touch bases on the progress, the learnings, the failures, the wins, creating exposure opportunities. That's all part of the formula. So I would say the number one way to engage is to make sure that work is meaningful.
Yeah. Yes. It'd be interesting to unpack. We don't have to do it right now, like what the word meaningful means, because I think everybody has their own interpretation. Just to give a quick little side anecdote, my last employer, that was a big part of how they thought about employee engagement was this notion of meaningful work. And one of the things that was really fascinating is we did this training on called polarities, balancing polarities. And, to one person, meaningful work might look like X, and to another person, it might look like Y. And those two things can be true at the same time. So it's like, how can you be as a leader situationally aware to say, for this person, meaningful work looks like this, and I need to be able to create an environment and an atmosphere where they can be able to do that type of work. And then this person is completely different. And how do I create a space for that as well? You might not know this. I think I may have shared the story at some point, but when I was going through leadership development with you, one of the exercises we did was like, we did the Myers-Briggs testing, and it was like leaders and their direct reports would take this test and learn what is their sort of personality characteristics versus someone else, or their tendencies rather, versus the folks who reported to them. It was like a bit of a light bulb moment for me because, I started to learn that like several folks on my team, they were like problem oriented. They were like, give me a problem, get out of the way. Like, let me solve a problem. That was meaningful for them. Like, I just want to have a big meaty problem that I can sink my teeth into and figure it out. And there was other people on the team that they were like, I need you to like give me very clear structure and guidelines for like how to operate. And like, I want to they felt, their cup was filled when they were like, they checked every box on their to-do list for the day. Like, that was meaningful. And so anyway, I think there's this whole sort of side tangent we could go on, which we probably will, is like the importance of knowing your people well enough to know how they define meaningful work, and then creating the environment where they can really, do that. And it's not necessarily the same for everyone.
Yeah, no, there's so many great frameworks that can really help you kind of get out of your own way if you will. So I love Myers-Briggs for that. There's so many ways to take that and the fact that you had a light bulb moment, right, is great because that's what it's designed to do. It's to say like, all right, people, I think most people understand around kind of introvert and extrovert. We've kind of gotten that's so kind of embedded within our culture a little bit. We're starting to learn so much more about that. But then, like you said, problem solving. Some people are really driven by data and problem solving. Other people really like ideas and generating ideas. And so how do you really kind of fully understand what someone is? And you can understand it by personality. You can also understand it by core motivation. There's a whole lot of work around that, which is different. Personality is kind of like what you do. And core motivations, it's like why you do it. And so many different frameworks for better understanding each other. And learning how to get the most, right? How do we extract the most out of everybody? So I love that was part of your for employees to have that experience as well.
Yeah. Well, we've got a couple minutes left. I'd love to do like a rapid fire exercise. So who's doing this well? Like, what are some companies that are known for great employee experiences? It doesn't mean they have to be perfect or they haven't made mistakes along the way, but like, what are some good, examples that come to mind for you?
Yeah. So I think about who did this first, right? Where was the first place that we kind of heard this? And I think of Disney, and Disney called their employees cast members, right? So when they would interact with guests, they were trained to think that they are on stage. And so when you're walking, that's why it's, the most magical place on earth. And so their employees were all trained to think this way and to know that they are creating, in fact, a tremendous customer experience and family experience that, this is, and so they were treated the same way. And so I think that's probably one that comes to mind for me in terms of how to be very open and deliberate about creating this synergy between what's happening with employees and what's happening with customers. You've been to Disney, I guess?
I have, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Been a few years, but yes, I have. And like, obviously, they're very well respected for their customer experience, like the Magic Band and stuff like that. They come up often on this podcast because people, it's like Disney's killing it. They've continued. I mean, they create a whole atmosphere where their employees are empowered and customers. It's all about surprise and delight and making things as like tailored and personalized. So yeah, love Disney. Big fan.
Yeah, Disney for sure. The other one that I think about is Starbucks. Again, like a big, bold statement. I think Howard Schultz describes it as, he thought about his father and wanted to make sure that, everybody that was working inside of the stores had access to healthcare and some of these other benefits that were kind of out of reach for folks who might not be full-time employees working, the standard 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, but putting them in, and I think they may have called them partners, but really kind of changing the dynamic around how they treat their employees and the benefits that they extol and extend to them.
Have you heard last week or the last 2 weeks, the new CEO rolled out this new kind of strategy, and basically they bought 200,000 Sharpies, and they're going back to the handwritten names on the cups because they've realized they've kind of gotten away from that personal touch and that human connection piece. I thought it was really fascinating because Starbucks has for a long time been a really, big brand. Everybody knows them, and they were very invested and focused on employee and customer experience, and I think they've strayed a little bit. So now they're saying, you know what, actually the personal touch is a really important keystone of who we are, and we're bringing it back. So anyway, I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that. And they used to all, and I actually love seeing people's names like on their cups, and when they call out their name. They also used to have like a series, I think, of phrases, like really nice motivational phrases that they would put on the cups and stuff. So to me, that brings kind of a certain level of warmth. Obviously, that coffee shop experience is one where you should feel, warm and cozy. So I love it. I'm all about those, all about the Sharpies.
Um,
And when they're funny too,
yeah,
sometimes like I've not too long ago I saw one that said, Brian with a Y.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
then they write Brian with a Y
Brian with a Y.
actually on
Yeah.
the up. So I think that's
This is kind
neat.
of a funny thing. Those who listen, they know this. I grew up in the Philippines, and it didn't matter how many times I would say my name was Drew. They would spell it as like Joe or Jew or kind of. So I ended up like my name is my legal name is simply Drew. It's not Andrew. So I had to get into the habit of like when I went to Starbucks, I'd say my name is Andrew because they like it was just a comical because then they're yelling Jules, and I'm like, is that me? I think that's me.
Love it.
Well, Beth, this has been an amazing conversation as always. I really appreciate you being on the show, sharing your insights. Where can folks find you online? And you mentioned workshops, so maybe share a little bit about what you do and how you can help companies.
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn or you can find me on talentdevelopmentspecialists.com. And I love creating workshops and delivering those to organizations. Focus a lot on leadership topics, professional development topics, things like you mentioned around Myers-Briggs. I do that or move into other areas like emotional intelligence and the skill development that comes with emotional intelligence, or something called actualized leadership. And that's where we talk about your core motivations. And that one actually also maps to something called actualized teamwork, where you can take a look at what your core motivation does as a leader and how that influences your team and how to become a more dynamic team. So that's just an example of a few of the workshops. And if you're thinking that you need more help on the strategic side for your organizational development, I work with a lot of small and medium-sized businesses on moving their I call them blueprints forward on that. So love work on what I call kind of both sides of the house.
Cool. And folks, you can find me online, drewburdick.com. Also, Drew H. Burdick on pretty much every social platform. Beth, thanks again for being on the show. Looking forward to continuing the conversation in months to come.
Terrific. Drew, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate you, big.
Yeah, and we'll talk soon. Hey there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you could take a second, hit the subscribe button below. It would really mean the world. I'm trying to make some great content for you every week by interviewing folks and hearing what they have to say about building great experiences. I try to share tips and tricks and things like that. Anyways, take a second, hit that like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.